Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful. May His peace and blessings be upon our Holy Prophet Muhammad and upon his progeny as well. Dear viewers, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you for joining us and welcome to The Convertsation, the TV program in which we discuss the ongoing needs, concerns, and challenges facing the daily lives of converts to the religion of Islam. You're joining me, Daniel Pizer, and my co-host, Sheikh Yahya Seymour, as we discuss today the subject of marriage. New Muslims are often faced early on with pressure to marry, and at the same time they find that either non-converts are unwilling to marry them or that they encounter problems with the parents of non-converts who are unwilling to allow them to marry their children. Additionally, some new Muslims have been married in the past, and in some cases have even had to go through divorce in order to convert to the religion of Islam or as part of their acceptance of that. Even after marriage, many young couples face difficulties in adapting to married life, and this can be especially the case with converts. And divorce, unfortunately, has become an increasingly prevalent issue in our communities, in part because of a lack of support for newly married couples. In fact, according to one study, the second largest group of ex-converts are the ex-wives of Muslim men. So today we're going to discuss how should the issue of marriage be approached with new Muslims, and what are the responsibilities in this regard for both new Muslims and the communities into which they're trying to integrate themselves. Let's examine the issues one by one and discuss the difficulties and challenges, as well as some possible solutions. Let me open up the discussion.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Well, thank you for introducing those topics tonight, Shaikh Daniel. Very important topics. One thing I would say that perhaps you failed to mention, and this is about being the perpetual nag. I'm very aware of the fact that I have a tendency, which is probably a negative trait, to correct you at the start of a show, but I believe one issue you failed to mention or failed to reference is the fact that the convert might not only face problems from the family he wishes to marry into if they be non-converts, but also from his or her own family.
That's very true, actually. I'm glad that you brought that up.
And so there's really a plethora of different issues here. A plethora of issues which need to be thoroughly discussed. And it is my hope that inshallah ta'ala we will be able to at least scratch the surface in this show, for it is certain we will not be able to do adequate justice to this topic in this show.
Yeah, this could probably be a separate lecture series.
I imagine this will probably stem off into a series of discussions within this show, especially in one in which we deal with the topic of those queries, observations, and stories we've been sent in by the convert community. And sadly, I'm well familiar with the fact from my own experience with converts that marriage is one of those biggest issues.
Well, let's take the issues one at a time then, and we'll add in the angle that you brought up, which is
inshallah
very important. I started out by saying that a lot of times that new Muslims, and I think this is maybe particularly the case with sisters, although certainly not exclusively, that when they accept the religion of Islam, they are sometimes pressured very early on into marrying. And sometimes this pressure even comes as a way of, before they've really learned the basic ins and outs of the religion, that marriage is presented as sort of both an obligation on them and also part of their learning experience, in the sense that if they marry someone who's already Muslim, then this will help them learn their religion.
Absolutely. That is certainly one dimension. I think one thing we have to be relatively honest about, although if you were to ask me, I personally don't think this is a great reason for conversion, but you and I have discussed this issue in the past, and I agree with you that it's not the worst reason for conversion. It can often serve as a catalyst for some individuals, but we have to be aware of the fact that some people do actually end up coming to a knowledge of Islam through the fact that they had already previously been in a relationship with a born Muslim. And so many of the, I believe the statistic you may very well have quoted may have largely covered people who converted to Islam through that means. Now, that's not to say that that's an illegitimate conversion. That's not to say that this conversion is doomed to failure. However, I do believe that one needs to make a conscious, real decision if they choose to convert purely on the basis that the spouse is Muslim. Now, that's not to say I haven't met people that have converted through that way and who have become really spiritual people.
Yeah, absolutely.
But in regards to the very issue you mentioned, people being pressured to marry, well, I converted at a very young age, namely 15 years of age. And so as a result, when I was that age, there was no pressure upon me to convert. Of course, I was a male, I was 15 years old, and so no one's really going to pressure you to marry at that age. And in fact, when I did eventually get married at the age of 20, I had people probably telling me I was a bit too young to get married. And people were rather concerned for my sake. They wondered whether or not it was the right decision to go into. Well, alhamdulillah, of shukr, I've been married now for coming up to 7 years and still going strong. Let's just pray it continues that way. But I do think that with sisters who convert and they're a bit older, say in their 20s, there's a substantial amount of pressure for them to get married. Not only a substantial amount of them to get pressure for them to get married, but sadly a substantial amount of pressure from the wrong people
In what
to get married. Well, you and I have discussed this disgusting psychological phenomenon which exists within the minds of certain people. Now, of course, it's almost impossible to detach oneself from the upbringing they have, the way they've been raised to think about others. But sadly, there is an extremely disgusting stereotype which is prevalent in the minds of not only the Muslim population, but also other people in the world too, which holds the opinion that just because someone is from a Western European background and they happen to be female, that they might be more inclined to promiscuity. More inclined towards being more willing to use a very popular way of saying it, put out.
Yeah, unfortunately this is something that I've heard a substantial amount about. But in terms of the initial pressure that people may face, in particular sisters, do you think that, I guess one of the concepts I have a hard time with, I understand in theory why people think that it's sort of the next level in their educational experience, in their religion, to get married, but I want to be really clear, I'm not trying to suggest that people should not marry early. I think actually we have that problem in our communities, that marriage increasingly happens later and later, very much in step with whatever the prevalent culture in a given country
And if someone leaves it too long, let's not lie to ourselves or be dishonest here. There is a general age which brothers consider to be the shelf life of a sister, and vice versa. And normally once someone surpasses that age, it is seen as if they have passed their sell-by date, and hence it's a lot more difficult for them to get married, particularly in the West.
So I'm absolutely not saying don't marry early, or even for sisters who convert to the religion of Islam later in life, that it's too late to get married. I don't want to give that impression either. But one of the things that I think is important for new Muslims, the main focus needs to be reorienting themselves and dealing with their families and learning the basics of the religion that they need to know. Throwing marriage into the mix, even for someone who's born Muslim, who has a good relationship with their family, and maybe work or other things like this, that can be a very trying, challenging experience. Throwing that on top of conversion, I think in many cases is a mistake. Unless we look at an example where someone is converting for the purpose of marriage, and maybe it's a sincere conversion, but at that point they're obviously not going to delay marriage until they...
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. I think one thing we have to be aware of here is that unfortunately when someone converts, the community has a tendency to bombard them with a plethora of different things which are not necessarily healthy nor conducive to the condition of the convert. So one thing I found myself bombarded with was the need of different trends within our religion who wanted to bring me into their trends would try and constantly bombard me with their theological baggage, their debates with the others in the community, their angle with others in the community. So it
Do you
became
mean cultural groups or what? I'm not sure.
no
kind of
more
by
more
trends.
religious groups here.
Okay. Yeah, sure.
But sometimes those religious groups are part and parcel of cultures too.
There can be a lot of
So, for
overlap.
example, many of the debates on the blessed Azadari rituals of Imam and Hussein are more intrinsically linked to the Indo-Pak community than any other community.
Yeah.
And so many of these groups would try and get me involved in those things. So, whilst I can't appreciate the marriage dilemma, I would say that I can appreciate what it's like to have something put onto your shoulders before you understand what the religion is fully about, understand the religion in its totality. And so, coming here to the house in Karbala again has allowed me to take a step back from the community and realize that this is really one area where converts are being failed in. Converts are being kind of pushed into these deep areas without first being given a very grassroots, ground level understanding of a religion and how it permeates their everyday life.
Sure. And in the process, if someone marries, and I've seen this in some of the feedback that we've received online, early on in their conversion, and by early on, I don't necessarily mean time-wise, I mean in terms of the timeline of their education in the religion,
Sure.
that frequently the religion that they learn from that, quote-unquote educational experience of marriage, the religion they pick up from that sometimes is heavily tainted by culture if they marry into, for instance, a Pakistani or a Iranian or Iraqi or whatever family. And this is not to sort of cast aspersions on
Any
these
of those
families or these
ethnicities, yeah.
ethnicities, sure. I think that that's a very natural thing. But the problem is that for someone who's new to the religion, relatively speaking, that it's going to be more difficult for them to distinguish between what things are
legitimate
Islamic issues and versus what things are cultural issues that they can choose to adapt or not adopt rather for themselves.
Sure.
Whether it's dress or food or other things like this. And the other problem that's sort of attached to this that I've heard repeatedly are cases where sisters who converted, coming from failed marriages, feel like the religion that they were taught by their husbands has very little in common with the religion of Islam.
With the actual real Islam of Al Muhammad.
Yeah.
alayhi salam.
And unfortunately, sometimes those relationships can become exploitative in some ways, and that can very much color their perspective of the religion that they've adopted for themselves.
I think it's very necessary for us here to talk about the detrimental consequences of what such a relationship, if the convert is inexperienced with a real Islam, can do to a person. So, we know you're someone who was previously involved with counseling, I believe, till now you still maintain a keen interest in counseling, Shaikh
Yes.
Daniel. So, you would be more of an expert on this than me. But it's clear, according to our experiences in the world and according to empirical studies, that when someone has a negative mental association of a concept, then that concept in their own minds becomes distorted. It becomes something that they no longer wish to come close to. So, for example, if I were to, let me try and throw out a radical example here.
Okay.
If I were a Westerner a Filipino. If I were a Filipino, well, I am half Filipino.
Yeah, I was going to say,
so,
it's not much of a
you know,
structure.
if I were a Filipino who grew up in Saudi Arabia, working as a servant in a traditional, culturally religious family, Saudi family's house, and I were to be treated in an extremely negative way by these people who I can see dedicate time to go pray, dedicate time to go to the mosque, or always observing religion to the letter, yet they treat me as a disgusting, subhuman individual. I will have this nasty negative affiliation of Islam, which is that, look, it's a religion which treats non-Muslims, non-Arabs as this subhuman person. And so, if I go back to the Philippines in that state as a Catholic, I'm going to start thinking to myself, well, I want nothing to do with Islam. No matter how much someone tries to deconstruct that and say that, no, look, the Prophet of Islam, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, said this, that there's no superiority between an Arab and a non-Arab. I'm still going to have that mental affiliation, and it's going to be extremely difficult for me to trust any real humanitarian reading of Islam afterwards. So I think we have to bear in mind that even though we can take these converts aside afterwards and say, look, you know, what happened to you in your marriage was merely the nasty side of, be it Saudi culture, Iranian culture, Pakistani culture, or any culture even.
Yeah, absolutely.
For example, British culture in some cases. It's not going to, unfortunately, have the same effect as it would have done if we were able to teach them this before they got married.
Sure.
And
yeah, if you can prevent the damage beforehand, it's much easier than
absolutely
undoing that after it's been done. It's very difficult.
Absolutely. Which is why Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salatu wasalam says that prevention is better than cure, especially.
Absolutely.
He says to abstain from committing a sin is much better than to go and repent for that sin later on.
I think that we're going to go to break in a moment.
Inshallah ta'ala.
But when we come back, one of the things that I think maybe we should talk about are, in practical terms, sometimes the criteria that Muslims in general, and certainly new Muslims, encounter when it comes to marriageability or other things like that.
Inshallah ta'ala.
Inshallah. We'll be back from break in a moment. Joining us again, welcome back to the conversation. When we left off, we were discussing the issue of marriage. One of the things that new Muslims might encounter when trying to marry, or even not so new Muslims, sometimes even very seasoned converts, is difficulty with their encounters with prospective families or prospective in-laws. In particular, this can take the form of sort of impossible to meet standards that families may impose if they're willing to engage with a convert from the outset in terms of discussing marriage. I can say from my own experience, these standards frequently, before I say that, let me preface this. We learn really beautiful things in our religion. And one of those things, as you mentioned, is that people are equal. The Prophet, peace be upon him, said equal like teeth on a comb, and that we see in our narrations over and over again that the standards for marriage are piety and religiosity and this kind of thing. To not worry about income or other things like this. To get back to what I was saying, that frequently, and this happens in many areas, I think with converts, is that there's a point where the rubber hits the road, so to speak, and you see that there's a massive clash between the beliefs of the religion and the realities of how that religion is practiced. And so when you approach a family sometimes, the questions that you'll get asked, they're not about your religiosity or other things like that, or about your making sure you have correct belief even, which I think is an incredibly important criteria.
Absolutely.
Instead, there are questions about your job, your economic stability, what kind of degrees that you have, what universities those degrees are from, standards that maybe I've even mentioned in a past broadcast. I mean, Imam Ali alayhi salam, he wouldn't meet these criteria. if that's how you're going to judge things.
Absolutely.
And that this is frequently a very big hurdle for converts. And this is leaving aside sort of the cultural clash issues or other things that may come up, or concerns that maybe the person might leave the religion later, or there's some additional suspicions families might have. So they can encounter a lot of, it can make you feel very small as a person, I think. Like you don't measure up if you have repeated experiences like this.
Absolutely. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali at-tahirin. I often find this topic is one of the more ironic topics that we have to go through. And it certainly is one of those that till this day really does perplex my mind. Especially within our Shi'i community, the Islam which Ali Muhammad alayhi salam brought. You find that there's a lot more of a gravitation towards culturalism when it comes to the issue of mixed race marriages. And other communities who claim Islam for themselves, wrongly so of course, have unfortunately surpassed the true Islamic community in that sense for the acceptance of mixed race marriages. But what I will say here is the following, that absolutely I find that often there is an extremely high demand placed upon the converts, which really, had it been anyone else, would just not have been done.
You mean, for instance, if it was like a cousin or something like
Yeah,
that?
absolutely. So I have heard of cases where religious sisters will be given proposals by, for example, their cousins, and when they will comment that, you know, he's not religious, they'll be told things like, well, that's your problem, you know, if you're so good, you can make him religious, and so on and so forth. And you come to a point as well, I mean, I'll give a general principle here, and may Allah forgive us all, may Allah forgive all the mu'mineen for all the mistakes that they make in these issues, but when I myself got married, of course my wife is from a traditional Muslim background, I won't go into the country or details or any issues like that, but her parents were very accepting. They were religious in that sense and did not perceive race as a big issue. But say some of her more qualified religious, I guess we could say, relatives were the ones that kind of, without being overly in my face about it, were kind of the ones who demanded more from me and would constantly just want to test my Islam and kind of test my qualifications in that sense. And one thing that I found was, you know, often I find this is just the case with people who are overly judgmental, even if it is from their lens a religious judgmentalism. I found when I was overly judgmental of people in the past, I would often have more shortcomings than the people I'm judging. And
sure, absolutely.
I think this is a principle mentioned in the Rawayats.
A lot of the shortcomings we notice in others, I think, just as a brief aside, are things that maybe we are projecting a little bit.
Absolutely.
There are our own shortcomings.
Absolutely.
And the more negatively we react to them in someone else, the greater indicator it is that we possess that same shortcoming, probably in a greater amount.
No, absolutely. I tend to agree with you, and I think as a general rule that seems to be true. But in this particular case, with this one relative, I just found that, like, despite the fact I was facing a lot more difficulties from that one distant relative, I found that the very things he was trying to question my religiosity about, in the future, he was exposed as having his own shortcomings in those areas. And so it's just ironic, in my opinion, that it's always, there's always seems to be the same symptoms involved. In regards to the questions about worldly qualifications and all that stuff, unfortunately, I think it's very true. I think, sadly, some people, they might view themselves as being the most religious people ever. But when it comes to the issue of marriage, it's almost as if that 1% doubt or uncertainty. I think uncertainty is a better word to use than doubt. That they might have in their mind seems to come out. So, for example, they might believe in a God and the hereafter, and the fact that Islam has all these things such as not having to worry about your rizq. But then, I think it's Shaitan comes and uses things like love for their daughters or love for their sons.
Absolutely.
And comes out and goes, well, what about my daughter's future? What about her stability in this life? And so, through using these kind of questions in their hearts, they might now stop thinking about, is my daughter's spouse going to get her to the hereafter? And start thinking more about, is my daughter's spouse going to get her a nice, stable home where she can live with her children, and they'll be well off and not have to worry about the kind of strife of poverty and all these other issues which come along with the dunya.
It's certainly not, you know, an illegitimate or unreasonable concern to have. The difference is when it transitions from being a concern to being almost a kind of neurosis.
An obsession.
Yeah, where essentially you've abandoned tawakkul, you've abandoned reliance on God. Yeah. And at the same time, you know, we have one narration part of it says that, you know, if you chase the world, that the world will run from you.
Yeah.
And it's very much an example of that, I think. So even some of these families, they may find that if they do end up marrying their daughter, for instance, we keep using this example probably because I think we're both men, but to the wrong person or something, that if they marry them to the right person, that because they've applied these non-Islamic criteria, that sometimes we still see these marriages failing, and even though their daughter or son, whatever, may be comfortably provided for, it doesn't mean that they're happy in their marriage.
Absolutely
not. I think what's a more painful irony for me, if we can even call it that, is the fact that in many cases, for converts that we've gone through and continue to go through in a lot of cases, a very difficult separation sometimes from our own biological families.
I'm just going to bring that up myself, actually.
And then at the same time, we're repaid for that by what's frequently a slap in the face to say, but you're also, congratulations, you converted. You had to leave your own family maybe, but you're not worthy of joining our family.
You know, absolutely, I agree with you entirely. And this is something that always comes back to bother me, and it's almost like a slap in the spit in the face from our own community, as in the religious community of believers. Because I remember when I first wanted to go study Arabic and Islamic studies at university and pursue minimal seminary education in the UK, house education in the UK, my family was telling me, you know, you're doing law here and you want to go leave this and join a seminary for some religious mumbo jumbo. Everyone's going to think you're a joke. What kind of lifestyle is that? What kind of education are you going to have? What will you do in the future? Everyone's going to ask you these questions. And I'm thinking, yeah, maybe all the non-Muslims might ask me these questions, but you know, alhamdulillah, I'll have a community of believers that are understanding.
Exactly.
And you and I both know that whenever anyone finds out that you're a seminary student, they might be able to stall that question for a few minutes, but it's always thrown in. So if you don't mind me asking, what are you planning to do in the future, you know? It's as if our believers have been shaped by the non-Muslim attitude towards these issues. And so it's extremely painful when you have to deal with your biological family, who are non-Muslims, separating from you over these issues, only to find, as you said, that if you go to propose to a new family, you face exactly the same issues.
What are some of the things, before we move forward, I have no idea how much time we'll have to discuss the rest of the issues that I brought up, but just so we don't miss the opportunity to discuss it, what are some of the ways that new Muslims or converts, maybe not new Muslims per se, but converts can cope with some of these issues until there are some kind of cultural changes in their communities? And at the same time, what can religious communities do to provide more support in this area in terms of raising awareness about these issues?
I believe in regards to these issues, one thing we can do in order to raise awareness is to construct the Islamic personality within the new convert. And I believe that that should be the very foundation of every conversion program. So this is one thing that was completely lacking in any seminary studies I did. It was completely lacking in the programs of any houses I went to. It was completely lacking in the programs of any university studies I went to in Islam.
Yeah.
And it's not part of the new Muslim projects which are often set up within our own masajid. However, we have heard from numerous of the teachers here in the house of Karbala that when they used to begin Hausa, prior to the time of Saddam, one of the texts that they were given would be a book like Huliyat al-Muttaqeen of Alam al-Majlisi,
Or Shahid al-Thanis.
or Shahid al-Thanis, Muniyat al-Murids, in which people are taught akhlaqiyat, and as a result we find that they had the building blocks essential to understanding the Islamic personality, almost like a foundational worldview through which implementation of and understanding of would allow them to deal with broader issues. I found that one of the sad things that is a reality and a result of the sad state of converts in the West today is one thing that we did not discuss about cultural families who these converts go and propose to is often, if they successfully do get married to a family of a non-convert background, even though that family might be religious, I've heard stories from people, like their in-laws might say when more extended family comes around to visit, oh, this guy, yeah, he's really good. He's for example, English or American, but he's a good American, you know, he's a good English guy. He's not like the rest of them. He's basically one of us.
Yeah.
And so what you have is you have this poor convert trying to become a naturalized Iraqi, Khoja, Pakistani, or Iranian, to such a degree where I've met converts who actually take pride in having to adopt a second identity, to such a degree where I've met converts who almost feel ashamed of their previous backgrounds and feel chuffed at the fact that people from the community edge them on, egg them on, and say things to them like, oh, you're pretty much one of us, you're one of the lads, you're an Iraqi, you're a Pakistani. And so I think through building the very foundation blocks of the Islamic personality, the Islamic identity, what it means foundationally to be a Muslim, and more importantly, what it means to be within wilayah of Amir al-Mu'mineen and the other 11 Imams, may peace and blessings be upon them all, we are able to break away from the unfortunate tendency to gravitate towards a cultural identity by replacing that cultural identity with a religious identity. And through providing those building blocks and foundational steps for that person to be in tune with his Islamic identity, we would be able to prevent him from, for example, or her from falling or being deceived or fooled by someone who's a cultural Muslim and is trying to sell them their own cultural version of Islam, as opposed to accept them within the blessed union of a truly Islamic marriage.
I think, for my part, it's the most that I can offer if someone were to come to me who's a convert and say, I'm having these problems, and I'm trying to find a family to marry. And you know, also one of the more difficult aspects of that for us is that outside of converts, for born Muslims, many times their families take a big role in networking and setting up prospective marriages.
Absolutely.
So you already don't have that avenue for the most part,
Absolutely.
unless you have some friends who can help you. And my advice in that regard actually would be to speak to leaders in your center or community. But this is one of the areas where patience becomes extremely important. And if you can master it around this issue, probably you can deal with it with most other issues. If someone came to me and said they had these problems, I would have a difficult time giving them concrete things that they can do, particularly if they don't have these other criteria, these non-Islamic criteria that are often applied. And let's be realistic, even if they met most of these criteria, there would still be some the goalposts are always changing.
I agree with you. I do think it's ideal to speak to the leaders of community, although I think that if you are a sister, for example, perhaps you should speak to one of the more senior sisters of the community.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, just to divert from the topic for 1 second, we had a viewer who was from the States, actually. I believe from the state that you've been living in quite recently. And I don't want to go into detail here, but they had addressed a particular concern they had in which they claimed that there were some issues of a community leader over there.
Yeah.
I cannot take that sister's word on trust. I mean, she mentioned a leader in that community, she mentioned names and some things that had gone wrong in pursuit of marriage. Sister, we appreciate the email and the message, and we hope that such phenomenons are not traditionally happening with convert sisters, with these community leaders. But as a prevention of what this sister is saying, perhaps I might suggest that sisters do not put themselves into a position with men where they're isolated with them, even if it is a community leader, and try and find a more senior sister to approach.
Fair enough. I think that that's very reasonable advice. So maybe then for brothers, at least, if you can approach the community leader, if they're going to be open and responsive to that, and give them the benefit of the doubt at first. A lot of times they will be. But I think in terms of where change needs to come from on this issue, the biggest area is within the communities themselves. I think to some extent that's going to happen naturally over time.
Yeah.
The more generations are born from immigrant communities in the U.S. or the U.K. as well, hopefully, that those particular un-Islamic criteria, or I should even say cultural criteria or things like this, that someone needs to be from a particular background or whatever else, over time those will fade away. But in the meantime, and in the last couple of minutes that we have left, what I would personally recommend to resident alims or other people like this who are influential in centers, and honestly to any believer watching, is to ensure that this issue is something that's pushed in communities, and that it's not something that you let go or don't call out when you see this happening with families or with people in the communities. Because if you have converts in the community, I can basically guarantee in some way, shape, or form they're suffering, and there's something that we can do to try to alleviate that. In this area, the biggest problem is a deficiency in taqwa, I think. That if you have, the only way that I can rationally understand it is that someone lacks sufficient fear in God, that they're willing to impose their own criteria over God's for something like marriage, and that their children may suffer as a result of that.
I agree with you. It's certainly foundationally a problem of a lack of fear, a lack of taqwa. However, one thing we might say is that, I don't want to judge people for doing this too much, because they are to some degree conditioned by their own family backgrounds and upbringing. And when we say a lack of taqwa here, it might not be a conscious lack of taqwa.
Certainly.
It's merely just an ignorance as to what Islam teaches, or to some degree a subconscious level of lack of taqwa.
Well, that's it for this program. Thank you for joining us again. If you would like to join the conversation, you can email us convert@imamhussein3.tv. And inshallah, you'll join us for another episode. Perhaps we'll have to continue discussing the issue of marriage and that as well, because we didn't get all the way through what we wanted to. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.